The most experienced mountain guide in the Chugach Range stood at the base of the Matanuska Glacier and told the woman with the 10-year-old daughter that building shelter inside ice was the stupidest idea he'd heard in 30 years of alpine rescue. He wasn't alone. By September, every pilot and prospector in the territory was talking about the widow who'd lost her mind carving a home into a glacier with her child. They called it everything from suicide to insanity. Some laughed, others prepared to recover bodies come spring. But when October's unprecedented storm system dropped temperatures to 45 below zero and winds reached 120 miles per hour, killing 16 people across the territory and destroying every surface structure within 50 miles, something impossible happened inside that blue ice. Warmth without wood shortage, protection from wind that tore steel buildings apart, and survival where everyone else died or fled. Today, you'll understand why the most mocked shelter became the most studied structure in Alaska Territory, and how ice 4 feet thick became the best insulation ever built when everyone assumed it would be a frozen tomb. Claire Hewitt stood at the face of the Matanuska Glacier in August 1952, holding her daughter's hand and looking at the massive wall of blue ice her husband had photographed 3 months before the avalanche took him. She was 30 years old, a former glaciologist's assistant with a geology degree from the University of Washington, and she had her husband's research notes, a 10-year-old daughter named Sophie, and an understanding of ice physics that contradicted everything the territory's old-timers believed about cold and survival. Her husband, David, had spent 2 years studying the thermal properties of glacial ice before the spring avalanche killed him and 2 other researchers in April 1952. They'd been taking core samples at 8,000 feet when the snowpack released without warning. David's body was recovered 3 days later. His research notes were found in a waterproof case still strapped to his pack. His final paper, unpublished, sat in Claire's pack now. Glacial Ice as Thermal Insulation: Counterintuitive Applications in Extreme Cold Climate Shelter. The academic community had rejected it 6 weeks before his death, calling it theoretical without practical application, interesting but unproven. 3 reviewers had used the word implausible. David had been preparing a field demonstration when he died. Claire intended to complete what he'd started, not just for science, but because finishing his work was the only way she knew to hold on to him. Sophie understood this without needing explanation. At 10 years old, she'd learned that grief looked like her mother studying thermodynamics equations late at night, that love meant proving someone's vision was real, and that the best way to honor the dead was to complete what they'd left unfinished. The glacier face rose 200 feet, ancient ice compressed over centuries into dense blue crystal. Most people saw it as frozen death. Claire saw it as her husband had, a material with thermal properties that could save lives if properly understood. Solid glacial ice, when thick enough, didn't conduct cold the way thin ice did. It insulated. The Inuit had known this, building igloos from snow blocks. David had theorized it could work at larger scale with glacial ice. Claire planned to prove him right. Sophie, 10 years old and already accustomed to being different, looked at the towering ice wall and asked the practical question she'd learned from her father. What's the thermal conductivity of 4-foot glacial ice at -40? Claire smiled, hearing David's influence in the question. Low enough to keep us alive, she said. Let's find out exactly how low. The criticism started immediately. Tom Marsh, the most respected mountain guide in the Chugach Range, found Claire surveying the glacier face 2 days later. She was taking measurements, marking locations, planning her excavation with the precision of someone who understood that mistakes in ice meant death. You planning to dig into that glacier? Marsh asked. Claire didn't stop measuring. I am. Marsh was quiet for a moment, processing this. Mrs. Hewitt, I knew your husband. Good man, smart researcher. But this, he gestured at the ice face. This is different than laboratory theory. This is suicide. You and that girl will freeze to death inside ice. Claire met his eyes. Ice 4 feet thick has an R value of approximately 16. That's better than most wood frame walls. If we can maintain interior temperature above freezing with minimal heat source, the ice becomes insulation, not exposure. Marsh shook his head. Ice is cold. Cold kills. That's not theory. That's fact I've learned from 30 years pulling bodies out of these mountains. Ice don't keep you warm. It keeps you dead. Claire thanked him for his concern and continued measuring. She'd heard variations of this argument from every experienced person in the territory. They were wrong, but explaining why required understanding thermodynamics they'd never studied. She'd have to prove it instead. Over the next 4 weeks, Claire and Sophie carved into the glacier with methodical precision. The work was exhausting, physically brutal in ways that left Claire's shoulders burning and her hands cramped even through thick gloves. Glacial ice wasn't like snow or even regular ice. It was dense, compressed under its own weight for decades or centuries, hard as concrete in places. Claire used ice axes to create initial breaks in the surface, finding natural fracture lines in the crystal structure. She used ice saws, tools borrowed from commercial ice harvesting operations, to cut blocks that could be removed. She used picks to chip away at stubborn sections, and occasionally carefully placed small charges to fracture large problem areas, always ensuring Sophie was at safe distance. Sophie helped where she could, moving smaller ice blocks using a sled Claire had designed, organizing tools by function and frequency of use, marking depth measurements on a chart, learning her mother's determination through 12-hour days of monotonous, back-breaking work. They worked from dawn until the alpine light failed around 4 p.m. in late August, then descended to a tent camp at the glacier base, ate cold meals because they were too exhausted to cook properly, slept hard, and returned at sunrise to continue. Some days they progressed 3 feet. Some days, when the ice proved particularly dense, or when weather forced early stops, they progressed 6 inches. The shape Claire carved was specific. An entrance tunnel 8 feet long, sloping slightly upward to prevent cold air pooling, opening into a main chamber 12 feet in diameter and 8 feet high, with 2 smaller side chambers for storage and sleeping. The walls she left 4 feet thick, calculating thermal mass and insulation properties. The ceiling she carved in a dome to prevent melt drips and maximize structural strength. Every surface was smooth, minimizing air pockets that could collapse. By mid-September, the basic structure was complete. Claire installed a wooden floor over the ice, creating an air gap for additional insulation. She built a small raised platform for sleeping, getting bodies off the coldest layer. She installed a tiny, efficient stove, barely larger than a camping unit, vented through a carefully melted chimney hole in the ice ceiling. The key was minimal heat, just enough to keep interior temperature at 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Any warmer would melt the ice. Any colder was unnecessary, because the thick ice walls blocked exterior cold completely. The town's reaction in Palmer was uniform mockery. At the trading post, men made bets on how many days before mother and daughter froze to death. At the airfield, pilots told the story as a cautionary tale about city people who didn't understand Alaska. At the Territorial Administration Office, someone filed a concern with Child Protective Services, questioning whether a woman who built an ice shelter should have custody of her daughter. One person didn't mock. James Chen, a civil engineer working on the new Glen Highway project, came to see the shelter in late September after hearing about it from a surveyor. He was 38, raised in Seattle's International District, where his parents had run a grocery store, educated at Caltech on a scholarship earned through relentless academic excellence. And he'd worked on cold climate construction from Alaska to Greenland for the Army Corps of Engineers. He understood thermodynamics not as abstract theory, but as practical necessity. Men died when buildings failed in cold, and he'd seen enough bodies to take shelter design seriously. He climbed to the glacier with Claire's permission, making the ascent with practiced efficiency, and examined her work with professional interest rather than curiosity or skepticism. He didn't speak at first, just measured, calculated, checked load-bearing ice integrity, examined her ventilation design. After 20 minutes of silent inspection, he spoke. "The ice walls are uniform thickness?" he asked, measuring with a tape he'd brought. 4 feet minimum, Claire confirmed. "Some sections are thicker, where the natural ice formation allowed. I calculated minimum safe thickness at 3.5 feet for R16 insulation value, but I went conservative." Chen examined the entrance tunnel's upward slope, the dome's ceiling's arc, the carefully melted chimney hole with its installed metal pipe. He did calculations in a notebook, checking her work against engineering standards he'd memorized. "This could actually work," he said finally. "If you can maintain steady interior temperature without melting, if the ventilation prevents CO2 buildup, if the structure stays stable through thermal cycling." "Those are significant ifs, Mrs. Hewitt." Claire nodded, appreciating that he was taking it seriously enough to identify real concerns rather than dismissing it outright. "That's why we're testing it before deep winter. I've calculated maximum safe interior temperature at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, melt rate at the wall surface exceeds safe parameters. Below freezing is unnecessary because the ice blocks exterior cold effectively." Chen looked at her seriously, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen from anyone else. Recognition. Not agreement, not skepticism, but recognition of someone working from data rather than assumption. "Mrs. Hewitt, I'm not mocking this. I'm concerned. If something fails, you and your daughter could die before anyone could reach you. Have you considered that risk?" "Every day," Claire said quietly. "I've also considered the risk of not trying. My husband believed this would work. He died before he could prove it. I'm proving it for him, for Sophie, and for every person who might need this knowledge someday. Because if this works, it changes everything we think we know about cold climate survival." Chen was quiet for a moment. "You need monitoring equipment, thermometers at multiple points, barometric instruments, data recording. If you're going to prove this scientifically, you need data." "I can provide equipment. I'd like permission to document this." Claire agreed. Over the next 2 weeks, Chen installed monitoring equipment throughout the shelter. Thermometers at floor level, mid-height and ceiling, humidity sensors, barometric pressure gauges. He taught Sophie how to record readings in a logbook, making her the project's official data recorder. Claire and Sophie moved into the ice shelter on October 1st. The first night was a test of nerve more than physics. The blue ice walls glowed in the lantern light, beautiful and alien. The space felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with psychology. Sophie lay in her sleeping bag on the raised platform and asked quietly, "Mama, are we going to die in here?" Claire sat beside her. "No, sweetheart. We're going to prove that ice can save lives. What's the temperature? Sophie checked the thermometer. 38 degrees. And outside? Checked the exterior gauge Chen had installed. 19 degrees. So the ice is keeping us how much warmer? Sophie did the math her father had taught her. 19 degrees warmer. That's the point, Claire said. The ice isn't making us cold, it's protecting us from the cold. They slept warm enough that night, wrapped in good sleeping bags. The tiny stove burned for 2 hours before bed, raising interior temperature to 42 degrees. By morning, it had dropped to 36 degrees. Sophie recorded the data. Outside temperature had fallen to 12 degrees. The ice was working. James Chen visited twice a week through October, checking data, monitoring structural integrity, and increasingly staying for coffee and conversation. He and Claire talked about thermodynamics, about David's research, about cold climate engineering challenges. Sophie watched them with the awareness of a child who'd lost one parent and recognized when another adult made her mother smile. One evening in mid-October, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Chen spoke carefully. Your husband's paper was brilliant. The rejection was academic politics, not science. Universities don't like theories that challenge conventional wisdom, especially from junior researchers. Claire looked at him. You read David's paper? Chen nodded. After I saw your shelter, I requested it from the university. They still have it filed as rejected. It shouldn't be. Every calculation is sound. If you prove this works through winter, they'll have to acknowledge he was right. That matters to you? Claire asked. It matters, Chen said, because good science deserves recognition. And because I suspect you need to know his work wasn't wasted. Claire felt something shift. The same recognition she'd felt years ago meeting David. The sense of finding someone who understood not just the words, but the meaning beneath them. The first serious test came on October 18th. A storm system moved in, dropping temperatures to 28 below zero, with winds gusting to 80 miles per hour. Every structure in Palmer strained under the assault. The trading post lost its roof. 3 cabins collapsed under snow load. The territorial office declared an emergency, evacuating exposed homesteads. Tom Marsh organized rescue operations, pulling families from failing shelters, consolidating everyone into the most solid buildings in town. He thought about the woman and child in the ice shelter and assumed he'd be recovering bodies when the storm passed. Inside the glacier, Claire and Sophie were completely protected. The thick ice walls blocked wind entirely. They heard it, a distant roar, but felt nothing. Snow accumulated outside the entrance, but the upward-sloping tunnel prevented it from entering. Temperature outside dropped to 28 below. Interior temperature held at 38 degrees, with the tiny stove burning 2 hours morning and evening. Sophie recorded data every 4 hours, watching the numbers prove what her father had theorized. On the second night of the storm, she asked her mother, "Why doesn't the ice melt from the stove?" Claire explained what David had taught her. The ice is so cold, so massive, and we're adding so little heat that equilibrium stays below freezing point at the wall surface. We heat the air, not the ice. The ice mass absorbs any excess heat without changing state. It's thermal mass at enormous scale. Like those rock walls in that story about the cave lady? Sophie asked, remembering a tale her father had told her. Exactly like that, Claire said. Different material, same principle. Mass stores and moderates temperature. The storm broke on October 20th. James Chen climbed to the glacier the next day, worried despite understanding the physics. He found Claire and Sophie outside the entrance, calm and comfortable, recording data. "You survived," Chen said, relief obvious in his voice. "We were never in danger," Claire replied. "Look at the numbers." She showed him Sophie's meticulously recorded data. Interior temperature never dropped below 36 degrees. Outside reached 28 below. The differential was 64 degrees. The ice walls had blocked almost all exterior cold, while the minimal heat source maintained livable interior temperature. Chen looked at the data, at the mother and daughter who'd proven theory into fact, and said what needed saying. You've just revolutionized cold climate shelter design. Your husband was right. You were right. This needs to be published. Word spread slowly at first, then rapidly. Marsh climbed to the glacier to verify the impossible himself. He stood in the blue ice chamber, felt the surprisingly moderate temperature, examined the 4-foot walls, and finally understood what he'd been too experienced to see. Ice this thick doesn't transmit cold fast enough to matter, he said slowly, working through the physics. It's like, he searched for analogy, like a meat locker. Keeps cold out, not in. Claire nodded. Exactly. When you're inside thick insulation, it doesn't matter what the insulation is made of. It matters how effectively it blocks heat transfer. By early November, Claire had regular visitors. Territorial engineers, university researchers, military cold weather specialists, all climbing to the glacier to see the shelter that shouldn't work, but did. The US Army sent a cold weather survival team who spent 3 days measuring, photographing, and interviewing. Claire provided all of David's research, all of Sophie's data logs, and her own documented construction methods. The Army officer in charge asked the question everyone wanted answered. How much colder can this withstand? Claire was honest. I don't know. The theory says as long as we can maintain above freezing interior temperature with minimal heat, the ice walls will protect us regardless of exterior temperature. But I haven't tested beyond 28 below. We'll know more by February. The real test came in January 1953, a weather system that meteorologists would later call the worst in Alaska's recorded history settled over the territory. It formed over the Bering Sea, pulled Arctic air from Siberia, and slammed into Alaska with apocalyptic force. Temperatures dropped to 45 below zero across the interior. Winds reached 120 miles per hour, strong enough to flip trucks, strong enough to turn snow into horizontal projectiles that sandblasted exposed skin. The combination created wind chill approaching 100 below zero, cold that killed exposed flesh in under a minute, cold that froze diesel fuel solid in engines and made steel so brittle it shattered under impact. Radio warnings went out, but many areas lost power immediately. Across the territory, people died in horrifying variety. 16 confirmed deaths, dozens more missing and presumed dead. A family of 4 froze in their car when it stalled between Fairbanks and Tok. A trapper was found a mile from his cabin, apparently disoriented by the whiteout. 2 pilots died when their plane iced up and crashed. Entire settlements evacuated when heating systems failed or fuel supplies ran out. Buildings collapsed under wind stress and snow load, crushed by forces that exceeded design parameters. The territorial government declared a state of emergency, but couldn't enforce it because communication and transportation infrastructure had failed. Palmer, though relatively sheltered in the Matanuska Valley, suffered 4 deaths and the loss of 30 structures. The community center's roof collapsed. The trading post burned when a desperate fire for heat got out of control. Tom Marsh led rescue operations from a command post in the fire station, the only building with backup heat, and lost 2 toes to frostbite sustained during an extraction of the Morrison family from their failing cabin. James Chen's construction camp evacuated to Anchorage, abandoning equipment that was later found destroyed. The storm lasted 6 days. Inside the glacier, Claire and Sophie maintained their routine. The ice walls blocked wind completely. The cold outside was irrelevant when it couldn't penetrate 4 feet of dense ice. Interior temperature held at 36 to 40 degrees with their tiny stove. They were comfortable, safe, and systematically recording data that would rewrite survival protocols across the Arctic. Sophie, now 11, and pragmatic beyond her years, recorded the peak differential on January 14th. Exterior temperature 47 below zero. Interior temperature 38 degrees. Differential 85 degrees. Claire held her daughter that evening and said what they both understood. "Your father saved our lives. He saved us before he died by understanding what no one else saw." Sophie nodded, then asked the question that had been forming for months. "Is Mr. Chen going to be my new papa?" Claire was surprised, but perhaps shouldn't have been. Children saw clearly what adults complicated. "Sweetheart, it's complicated." "Why?" Sophie asked. "He cares about us. He helped us prove Papa's theory. He makes you smile. You trust him with the data. Papa would like him." Out of the mouths of children came truth that required months of adult circumnavigation. Claire realized she'd fallen in love with James Chen, somewhere between thermodynamics discussions and data reviews, somewhere in the shared understanding that David's work mattered, and proving it was worth risk. "That's something Mr. Chen and I would need to discuss," Claire said carefully. "But yes, I think your father would like him." When the storm finally broke on January 20th, rescue teams fanned out across the territory, assessing damage and counting dead. Tom Marsh, despite his frostbite, led a team to the Matanuska Glacier, expecting to find bodies or nothing at all. He found Claire and Sophie outside their shelter, warm and healthy, with 6 days of data that showed sustained interior temperatures of 36 to 40 degrees, while exterior temperatures reached 47 below zero. Marsh sat on an ice block and laughed, the kind of laughter that comes from having every assumption shattered. "I was wrong," he said, "about the ice, about your chances, about everything. I've been guiding these mountains for 30 years and I didn't understand the first thing about ice physics." Claire smiled kindly. "You understood survival based on experience. You just hadn't encountered this specific application. Different knowledge, not wrong knowledge." Marsh shook his head. "No, I was wrong. Your husband saw something I missed. You proved something I said was impossible." "That's not different knowledge, Mrs. Hewitt. That's me being too damn sure I knew everything." James Chen arrived 2 days later, having driven from Anchorage as soon as roads cleared, navigating through debris and around abandoned vehicles, taking 8 hours to cover 60 miles. He found Claire reviewing data outside the ice shelter, and Sophie building an elaborate snow sculpture. Surprisingly cheerful, given they'd just survived the worst storm in territorial history. He stood, looking at them both. These two people who'd survived the unsurvivable and proven theory into fact, and had to take a moment to process his relief. He'd spent 6 days in Anchorage not knowing if they were alive, unable to reach them, calculating odds and trying not to imagine worst cases. Seeing them healthy and calm shattered something he'd been holding rigid inside. "Claire," he said, and his voice wasn't entirely steady. "I need to say something before I lose courage. I've thought about this for 3 months, practiced speeches, considered timing and propriety, but I'm done waiting for perfect conditions, because Alaska doesn't do perfect. Your husband's work was brilliant. Proving it was brave. Documenting it has been the honor of my career. But I'm not here just for the science anymore. Somewhere between thermodynamics discussions and data logs, between watching you carve ice and watching Sophie record temperatures, I fell in love with a woman who trusted physics over fear and taught her daughter that understanding beats assumption. If enough time has passed that it wouldn't dishonor David's memory, if you think he'd understand, I'd like to be part of your lives. Not to replace him, because he can't be replaced and shouldn't be, but to add to what you're building, to help raise Sophie, to maybe build more impossible things together. Claire looked at this man who'd believed in her project when others mocked, who'd provided equipment and expertise without asking for credit, who'd documented everything so David's work would be recognized, who'd driven 8 hours through post-storm chaos just to confirm they were alive. "James," she said carefully, "David would have liked you. He'd have appreciated that you took his theory seriously. He'd have respected that you helped prove it instead of claiming credit. And he'd want Sophie and me to be happy. You already are part of our lives. The question isn't whether you join us. The question is whether you're ready for a life that includes glaciers, data logs, extreme weather, and proving everyone wrong on a regular basis." Chen smiled. "I'm an engineer who works in extreme cold. That's exactly the life I want." They married in March 1953, quietly in Palmer with Sophie as witness. The territorial governor attended, as did Tom Marsh, the Army Cold Weather Survival Team, and a delegation from the University of Washington, who came to apologize for rejecting David's paper and request permission to publish it posthumously. Claire granted permission with one condition. James Chen would be listed as co-author for his documentation work. Chen tried to refuse. Claire insisted. "Science," she said, "is collaborative. David had the theory. I proved it worked. You documented it. We all contributed." The paper was published in the Journal of Cold Regions Engineering in June 1953. Glacial Ice as Thermal Insulation, Field Application, and Empirical Validation, by David Hewitt, Claire Hewitt, and James Chen. It included Sophie's data logs, construction photographs, and thermal analysis that revolutionized Arctic shelter design. By winter 1953, the U.S. Army had built 3 experimental ice shelters in Alaska using Claire's methods. By 1955, ice shelter construction was standard training for Arctic survival specialists. By 1960, permanent ice structures existed across Alaska and northern Canada, some housing research stations, others providing emergency shelter. The original shelter in the Matanuska Glacier remained standing for 17 years. Claire and James used it as a research base, studying glacier thermal properties, documenting long-term ice structure stability, and teaching others the principles David had discovered and Claire had proven. Sophie grew up measuring temperature differentials and understanding that her father's legacy wasn't his death, but his insight. That her mother's courage wasn't recklessness, but calculated trust in physics. And that family could be built from shared purpose and mutual respect. In 1968, a glaciologist from MIT wrote her dissertation on vernacular ice architecture in Alaska. She documented the Hewitt Shelter and 43 structures built using Claire's methods over 15 years. Her conclusion was straightforward. Hewitt's application of glacial ice as insulation reduced heating requirements by 89% compared to conventional structures in extreme cold, while improving safety and survival rates. The approach contradicted experiential wisdom, but validated theoretical physics. Adoption correlates directly with crisis-driven necessity and empirical demonstration. People believed the numbers when their lives depended on them. Claire Hewitt Chen passed away in 1999 at the age of 77. Her obituary in the Anchorage Daily News mentioned her glaciology work, her family, and her contributions to cold weather survival research. But those who knew the full story remembered something different. They remembered the winter, when a widow everyone mocked built a shelter in ice and survived temperatures that killed 16 others because she trusted science over assumptions, because she honored her husband's insight by proving it real, and because she understood that the deadliest mistakes come from assuming experience is the same as understanding. She wasn't being reckless, she was being precise. And sometimes the most dangerous thing in the wilderness isn't the cold outside, but the certainty inside that prevents you from seeing solutions where everyone says none exist. Sophie Chen donated her childhood data logs to the Smithsonian in 2005. Careful notebooks recording temperature differentials from September 1952 through March 1953. Proof that an 11-year-old girl and her mother proved physics could save lives when everyone said it would kill them. The donation included David Hewitt's original research notes and Claire's construction diagrams, a complete record of how theory became practice, how mockery became validation, and how ice, the substance everyone feared most, became the shelter that saved lives when understanding replaced assumption and courage proved wisdom.